Good evening, folks. We hope you're here for Napa Solano Audubon Society's April meeting. We're in for a treat today. We have Jessica Griffiths, um, and she is from the in Colorado State University Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands and is stationed at the Vandenberg Space Force Base. And I can't wait to hear her presentation on why birds flock and many other things. We're going to get started now. It looks like we have a pretty nice audience and it's growing. So I will start off with our typical announcements. The first being, I'd like to welcome everyone to our meeting. So I hope you're enjoying it. We've sent out a couple e-blasts for tonight, and I also sent out an announcement about elections. We have elections coming up this spring, and we're looking for folks who might want to be a director to get their feet wet. So don't hold back. This is a great way to volunteer and be part of our organization and take a more active role. So you will get more information, but essentially our e-blast said, if you are interested in getting your feet wet, send an email to our membership chair, who's Judy Kale, and she will put your name on the ballot. So without further ado, our next program on May 9th, Thursday, May 9th, it will be Birding in the Sierras from the Valley Floor to the Sierra Crest with Denise and David Hamilton and Lucas and Mark Stevenson. We've teamed together to bring you the best of Sierra birding, and we have a lot of slides of birds. So come prepared for a slightly longer program, but the photos of birds are really fantastic between the Hamiltons and the Stevensons. We've done a good job. So a few other announcements. First of all, our citizen science is winding up. We have many teams that are monitoring bluebird boxes. So if you would like to join a team, please contact Tom Sliker. He coordinates that activity, and we right now have, I think, close to 200 bluebird boxes. And last year we fledged 500 young, which is like truly amazing. So if it's a lot of fun, you go with another person or two and you open up the boxes and you see at what stage they are and you take a record of that and you get to see the babies hatch and get fed by their parents and eventually fledge from the nest. So it's a lot of fun. We also have a program called Phenology Network Surveys. We have one at American Canyon Wetlands that it goes every Monday morning at 8 o'clock. And we have a second one at Benicia Community Park that I think is on Wednesdays. Is that correct? Okay. If you'd like to participate, again, let Tom know. Now you know why Tom is stepping down as vice president, because he is coordinating so many of our citizen science activities. He's also started a new program this year with kestrel boxes, which is very exciting to me because kestrels are on the decline. And I think he's put up 10 boxes in different locations where kestrels have been spotted. So we're excited to see if any of them will take this year. It may take a couple years to get them using them. We have a couple of exciting field trips coming up. Our coordinators are Wendy Cole and Bruce Thompson and Carol Boykin. Our next trip is to Clear Lake this weekend, April the 14th. Is that a Saturday? Sunday, April the 14th with Dr. Floyd Hayes. Dr. Hayes is a professor at Pacific University in ecology, and he's a great bird watcher, and he's been studying the grebes of Clear Lake. So you're going to have a lot of fun. They will go clockwise around the lake and look for e-blasts if you'd like to attend that one. The following field trip is currently full. It's May 11th through 12th, and it's called In Search of the Great Gray Owl in Ashland, Oregon. And that trip should be very exciting for those people participating. It has a waiting list. You never know who will drop out, so don't hesitate to put your name on the waiting list. It's being led by Harry Fuller, who is a longtime birder in the Bay Area and has moved to Ashland and is really up to date on where great gray owls are located. If you're interested in attending, please respond to the e-blast that's been sent out. Our weekly bird walks with Andrew Ford are continuing. I hear from one of the members here tonight that the Lagoon Valley trip last weekend or the weekend before saw almost 50 species. Is that right, Barry? Yeah. So Andrew is a phenomenal ornithologist and naturalist. He knows plants and animals and is fantastic with birds. So join him. He will be sending out an e-blast shortly if he hasn't already about the location for this Saturday's trip. Then we also have beginning bird walks, and tentatively our next beginning bird walk will be on Earth Day weekend on Sunday, April 21st. For sure, Tammy Saunders, who is our education coordinator, will be leading a trip at American Canyon Wetlands at 9:30. And it's possible our beginners will join her, or possibly they will go to a different area. I meant to wear my new Kestrel t-shirt and I completely forgot rushing here to the meeting. But Pam Condos is back from birding in Costa Rica, and she's in charge of our Kestrel t-shirts. One of our audience members, Bruce, has volunteered to model his t-shirt because he wore his. Bruce, come closer. Here he is. Bruce Thompson is, I know we can't see ourselves, unfortunately, for some reason, but if you sit down right here, right there, there's Bruce, and there's his Kestrel t-shirt. It's got our logo, Napaslano Audubon Society, and a beautiful kestrel that looks almost as much like a Eurasian kestrel as an American kestrel, but not too bad anyways. Thank you, Bruce. So get a hold of Pam Condos. Her number is on the website and she will get you a new t-shirt. I think they sell for $25. So it's a real bargain. They're a great t-shirt and they're due to last a long time. So the next thing on our agenda are our many Earth Day activities. We have about 5 Earth Day activities. The first was going to be this Saturday at Connolly Ranch. However, due to the rain that's scheduled to be here on Saturday, they have postponed it till later on in the summer. So that the event at Connolly Ranch has been canceled. However, Saturday, April 20th, Betty LaBatista, did I say that right? La Bastida will be leading our Napa Creek cleanup starting at 9 and going on to about 11 or 11:30, right on the corner of Main and Pearl, right in that area of Napa Creek. And people had a lot of fun cleaning the creek last year. So join Betty and her team, and you'll have a lot of fun with cleanup for Earth Day Napa Valley. Following that, starting at 11, that is Napa Valley Earth Day is taking place at the Oxbow, and we will have a booth there with a lot of fun things to do. So come by our booth, stop by our booth. There's all kinds of activities for Earth Day in Napa, and it's a lot of fun. So come on down. That is this Saturday. This year it's on a Saturday, April the 20th. The following day, American Canyon is celebrating their Earth Day Sunday, April 21st, and that's when Tammy Saunders is going to lead a bird walk from 9:30 to 12 at American Canyon Wetlands. Then on Tuesday, April 23rd, Tom Sliker and Judy Kale are going to have a booth at Solano Community College. We're really interested in getting college kids interested in ornithology and protecting habitat. So Tom will be there from 10 to 1 at Solano Community College in front of their main building there. And then on Saturday, April 27th, a group called Wing Migration, which is taking over the Flyway Festival next year, will be having a booth, many booths at Earth Days Vallejo, Saturday, April 27th from 10 to 4 in downtown Vallejo. So don't miss that one either. Finally, just a couple more announcements. The first is for the last 3 years, we've had a big day of birding to celebrate birding and to get people out and seeing whatever birds they can see to whatever ability they have. You can sit and just watch birds at your feeder. You can explore your neighborhood and bird, or you can take on the whole day and go wherever you want in Napa or Solano counties by yourself, with a partner, with a team, and see how many birds you can see. This is also an opportunity to support our organization. And we hope that if you do participate in our big day of birding, you'll try to get a sponsor or sponsor yourself, $5, $10, whatever works for you. One year, Lucas, my son, got his grandmother to bid $1 per bird. And of course, he went out and set the Napa County record, seeing 170 birds. So his grandmother was out a bit of change, but she didn't mind supporting our organization. So see what you can do, have fun. That is going to be Saturday, May the 4th. I've already mentioned our elections, but please take a look at that e-blast and respond to Judy Kale if you have any interest in joining the board and helping us with our mission. So tonight's program will be Why Birds Flock with Jessica Griffiths. You may have heard the old saying that birds of a feather flock together, but have you ever stopped to wonder why? Well, we're going to join Jessica tonight for a fascinating look at bird flocks and flocking behavior. She's got all kinds of other information about birds, about migration formations, and how do birds flying in large flocks synchronize their movements. I can't wait to hear. Jessica, once again, is a wildlife biologist for Colorado State University's Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands and is stationed at Vandenberg Space Force Base. So without further ado, Jessica, take it away. Don't forget to unmute yourself and we will mute ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah. All right, that's a fantastic introduction. And just real quickly, a little more about myself. I live in San Luis Obispo. That's where I'm coming to you from. And I've been out here for about 14 years, been in California about 20 years. Originally from the Chicagoland area, did my undergrad on the East Coast. But I really have been living here on the Central Coast of California for, almost about 20 years now. And I've been involved with local California chapters of the Audubon Society just about as long as that. So I really enjoyed sharing my love of birding with other folks. And I used to work at a nonprofit where we did a lot of outreach, and I got a lot of questions from folks. I love to say there's no such thing as a dumb question. And honestly, one of the questions I got was about bird flocking. Why do they hang out together? And so I actually started delving into that, and it's really fascinating. There's lots of reasons. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will delve right in. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, it's coming through perfectly, Jessica.
Okay, wonderful.
Perfect.
Okay, well, flocks are a really unique spectacle of nature, and they can be huge and dazzling, like this flock of starlings, or they could be loud and raucous, like a flock of crows, or they could be beautiful and mysterious, like a flock of geese flying in front of the moon. For a very long time, flocking birds have captured our imagination, but let's learn about why they actually do it and what is the science behind flocking. What are the birds actually doing? So let's start with the basics, okay? Pretty much all animal behavior can come down to benefits and costs. So there are many benefits to flocking together. One is cooperative foraging, right? Birds are helping each other find food, and they can be more efficient at it. They can also share information, not only about where resources are, so where's the best food, where do we get water, but also what kinds of predators are in the area, what should I be looking out for. Of course, safety in numbers, right? There are many more eyes looking out for predators in a flock. And it can be easier to find a mate if there are a lot of other birds like you in an area, as opposed to being sort of spread out across the landscape. So those are all benefits, but of course there are some costs. So along with helping each other find food, there's of course the flip side of that is increased competition for food, right? If you have a lot of birds in a flock, they might be all competing for the same food resources. There is also the higher risk of disease. Disease can spread faster when animals are gathered together. So that is definitely a risk for a flock of birds. We may have increased aggression between birds, for instance, if they are squabbling over food or over a mate. And so the real question that every bird has to, kind of figure out, it really comes down to accounting, right? Do the costs outweigh the benefits? And if the costs outweigh the benefits, then they will not flock together. But if the benefits outweigh the costs, then they will flock together. So it's kind of doing this type of math. So today I'm going to talk about some of the main reasons that birds flock together, sort of why and how. And these are sort of the 4 areas we're going to cover, right? Migration, foraging, information exchange, and safety. So we will dive right in and talk about migration. So when most people think of flocks, a lot of times they may think of that typical V-shaped flock of migrating birds. And so large birds are heavy and they need extra lift. So generally these large-bodied birds are the ones you see migrating together, right? Geese, ducks, cranes, swans, waterfowl, larger birds. And it's really all about energetics. That V formation actually generates lift for birds behind the wingtips of the leader. And those birds in the back do less work. The leader really does the most of the work, and then they switch out, right? It's the same principle as cyclists riding each other's draft. And this flight formation actually results in energy savings of up to 40% for those members of the flock that are behind the leaders. So it can really mean a lot of energy savings when birds are migrating hundreds or even thousands of miles. And so I want to talk about a scientific study that actually quantified how the birds do this. And so the researchers conducted this study examining how large flocking birds derive benefits from flying in this kind of formation. And they studied northern bald-faced ibises, really a face only a mother could love. I think they're actually very charming looking. And so what they did is they raised 14 juvenile birds and they trained them to follow a light plane. And they fitted every bird with a backpack containing a specially built GPS unit and inertial measurement devices. And those are devices built to measure the precise location of the bird, but also the speed that they're flying and when and how hard they are flapping their wings. So here's a picture of a juvenile ibis being fitted with one of those special backpacks. And I have video, which hopefully will actually play. Okay, so here is a video taken from the plane showing these juvenile birds flying all in a line. You can see in the lower right corner, that's the tire of the little glider. So not only, and that bird in front, you can just see it's wearing one of those special backpacks. So all the birds were fitted with those measuring devices, and then they were following the glider, and the glider flew all around and got all this data from them. Okay, so let's talk about results. And it turns out that the birds actually changed how they beat their wings depending on where they were in the flock. So when the birds were flying in a staggered position, okay, which is shown on the left side there, the little number A, the birds would phase or sync their wing beats with the bird in front of them, and that maximized benefits to that bird. But if they were flying directly behind the bird in front of them, as shown on the right, they would actually alternate wing beats with the bird in front, and that avoids detrimental downwash. So those birds were actually changing their position and how they were flying in order to maximize the benefits. They also moved around within the flock. So I'm going to show you guys this picture, which looks a little bit crazy. It seems a little confusing at first, but basically this is what we call a heat map. So each of these little crescents represents one of the individual birds. And the closer to red, that is the amount of time that the bird spent in that position in the flock. So if you imagine each little boomerang shot shape is the flock, and there's the position of each bird in the flock. So for instance, you can see the second row down, the center bird spent most of its time on the left side of the flock. But the bird below it spent most of its time in the center of the flock. But really what we see is that these birds were moving all over the flock. They're constantly changing their position. That means no one bird is doing the majority of the work. They're all sharing the load. So really fascinating results. And last but not least, they had to learn how to flap their wings optimally. They didn't do it at first. And because they didn't have an adult ibis to learn from, these juveniles, remember, they're following a human in a plane, not a experienced ibis. They had to learn on their own, and they learned from each other, and they did. And they actually pretty quickly figured out how to flap to not get as tired. So really, really interesting. So the next time you see birds flying in a V formation, you'll know how much work they're doing to save energy. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about flocks and foraging, right? Foraging means finding food. So foraging efficiency increases in a flock. One of the most important reasons for a bird to join a flock is that they improve their success at finding food. And the birds actually watch the other birds in the flock, and they learn the locations of food items and how best to get those food items. So if you think about a flock of birds in a tree, there might be, maybe there's a particular kind of insect that likes to hide under the bark. And so maybe one bird has kind of figured out that it can kind of lift up the bark and get that particular bug. The other birds will see that bird successfully foraging that way, and they will start doing it too. So they can learn from each other. Each individual bird will also spend less time watching for predators, right? That means that they have more time to look for food, and they don't have to spend as much time keeping an eye out. They can also grab prey or food which is flushed or maybe missed by another bird. So the example I have here, this is a picture of a flock of ground hornbills in Africa. They walk in a group. It's almost like beating the bush, right? And the birds in front, you might think that the birds walking in front might kind of get all the food, but they're often flushing prey that runs behind them, and then the birds in the back can snap up that prey. And so all the birds benefit from being in the flock. Another benefit to foraging is that birds can actually employ cooperative hunting. And a really great example of this is American white pelicans, who will actually surround a school of fish or other small prey and kind of tighten the net, all joining together in a circle with their bills open, kind of then scooping the fish up together. It's actually kind of similar to the way humpback whales will make a bubble net to encircle a school of fish and then come up in the middle with their mouths open. This is a really similar strategy. So they all work together to kind of force the fish to the center and then scoop them all up. And I really love this picture because look at that cormorant hanging out in the middle. That is the sweet spot. That cormorant has it figured out, right? It's just waiting for the fish to get pushed right to it. But this is a technique that the pelicans can't use on their own. They have to be in a flock in order to do it successfully. And so up until now, we've actually been talking about flocks composed of a single species, right? You know that old saying, we already, Mark mentioned it earlier, birds of a feather flock together. And that's rooted in the observation that large flocks of birds are very often comprised of just a single species. But of course, we know that birds of different species can and do form flocks. And when the purpose of the flock is to forage together, we actually call those flocks mixed species foraging flocks. And so these flocks are composed of multiple species of birds. They have an increased foraging efficiency, right? That means each individual bird in the flock is more successful at finding food in the flock than it would be on their own. And that's because these flocks are composed of species, different species who may forage using different techniques, and they can find more food. And remember, all of the birds in a flock are kind of paying attention to each other. So one type of bird may actually observe another type of bird using a particular foraging strategy that they may be able to copy. So they're just kind of increasing their ability to find food. They are led by what we call a nuclear species. This is the species that kind of attracts the other species to the flock and leads the flock. Now, I don't mean a bird exposed to radiation, but instead, nuclear refers to a species that acts as the nucleus of the flock. Okay, think about, right, the nucleus and the electrons orbiting around it. So that nuclear species forms the core of the flock. And nuclear species have to have certain characteristics, right? They have to be gregarious, right? Really social and like to form flocks. They have to have conspicuous plumage that's very easy to recognize, not only by each other, but by other birds. They need to be year-round residents, right? So they should be non-migratory. They're in an area all year round, so they're therefore very knowledgeable about those resources. And they need to have an easily recognized alarm call that other birds can recognize and react to. And so all mixed species foraging flocks, no matter where they are, will have this nuclear species. And in coastal California, including the Bay Area, one of our nuclear species is the chestnut-backed chickadee. And down where I am in San Luis Obispo, this is the primary nuclear species in the flock. And they are a permanent year-round resident. After the breeding season is over, they form social flocks. They have very bold and recognizable facial markings, and they have loud and recognizable calls. Okay, so they are one of our local nuclear species. So why would a bird join a mixed species foraging flock? Well, migrating birds passing through the area are very often unfamiliar with the area that they are stopping in. Okay, and so how do you find food in an unfamiliar place? For folks of my generation and older, say you traveled to a new place, maybe you took a road trip, you took a trip, and you needed to get information on, where do you eat around here? What's the best restaurant to go to? Before we had smartphones where we could just look it up, you would have to, right, ask a local, ask somebody who lives there, what's the best food? What's the best place to eat? And so it is actually beneficial for migrating birds to join flocks led by resident nuclear species, because those local birds know where the food is, they know what kind of food is in the area, they know where to get water, and they know the predators that are common to the area. And so basically these migrating birds can kind of hook up with these flocks of these local resident species, stop, get some food, join the flock, kind of get all the information from those birds, and then be able to forage very efficiently and then take off on their migration. So it's really beneficial to them. So here on the central coast of California, dozens of migrating species have been documented in mixed species foraging flocks, and many birders know that a really great way to find unusual or vagrant birds is to check that mixed species foraging flock. Oh, I'm sorry, somebody is unmuted.
You did late yesterday and turn it to just where it says T.
Can everybody make sure that they are muted, please? Oh, can I mute? Oh, great. Okay. I just muted it for him. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So if you're a birder in the fall, right, and you want to find a crazy migrant, find a chickadee flock and check everything that's there, right? You never know what might be there. I personally have found some really cool migrating warblers by checking those mixed species foraging flocks. So this slide just kind of is a little montage of those different species. Wilson's warbler, yellow warbler, Pacific slope flycatcher. Oh, I didn't update it. It's not western flycatcher, right? Downy woodpecker, warbling vireo, and Townsend's warbler. So all of these birds are very commonly associated with those mixed species foraging flocks. Now, what's really interesting is that in the tropics, in Central and South America, these mixed species foraging flocks are actually so important that species that flock and forage together have actually evolved matching colors, which is, to me, incredibly fascinating. And it could kind of function as maybe a badge that sort of increases acceptance by those flock members, or maybe even a uniform that aids in recognition of those friendly flock species, right? So the birds are able to kind of recognize, oh, you've got those colors, you're part of my group that we're all going to forage together. And in the mountains of Western Panama, the flock uniform is black and yellow. So these 6 species, as well as actually several other with similar colors, all forage in this flock together. And you can see they kind of all have these matching colors. Really neat. In the South Central Andes, the team colors are blue and chestnut. So here are 6 species that forage together. And there are actually several other examples of this in very specific regions in Latin America. So in these specific geographic areas, you get these groups of species that, you know, kind of have evolved these little team colors or uniform colors, however you want to think about it, to all forage together and to help them recognize each other. Okay, so we're going to change gears a little bit now, and we're going to touch real briefly on information exchange as a reason to flock together. So this slide here, for many of us in California, this might be a familiar fall and winter sight. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of crows gathering together at the end of the day and then flying to a roost together. And research has actually shown that when birds are roosting all together like this, they are communicating with each other. So information is being exchanged at these roosts, and we have a couple of different hypotheses that sort of explain this function. So one is called the information center hypothesis, and this posits that birds are exchanging valuable information about the location of food resources at the roost. So a really great example of a species that does this is the common raven. So ravens that discover a carcass one day will actually return to the carcass the next day and bring other birds with them. And researchers have actually demonstrated that naive birds, right, ravens that didn't know about the carcass, if those birds are released at the roost, they have no way of knowing where the carcass was, they will follow the knowledgeable ravens the next day. Therefore, the knowledgeable birds, the ones who know about the carcass or the food resource, are somehow communicating to those naive birds. Now, we don't know exactly what they're telling them. We don't know if they're actually somehow communicating where the location of the food is, or if they're saying, I know where food is, you should follow me. So maybe they just indicate, hey, in the morning when I'm leaving, follow me. We're not exactly sure the level, but we do know they're giving information to each other. Many species of vultures also roost communally and may make use of this information exchange. One really interesting study looked at Eurasian griffin vultures in South Israel, and they actually fitted them with GPS trackers and observed their movements. And this figure from the published study shows the GPS tracks of all the birds in red and the areas where they fed on carcasses, which are black dots. And you can see the bigger the black dot is the number of feeding events, right? The number of times birds were visiting those carcasses. And so you can see they generally all tended to kind of go to the same carcasses. So somehow they were following each other. If a bird found a carcass, it was able to tell the other birds or somehow communicate that. They followed 200 vultures over 5 years. And they found that birds who had found a carcass, which they called informed birds, would return to the roost. And then the next day, they were followed by uninformed birds to the carcass. So similar to the ravens, the vultures are communicating about food resources at the roost. Really cool. And one last example of this. So there's a species of weavers called red-billed quelea. They're native to Africa. They are in the weaver family and they form these massive flocks. They breed communally, and this results in these large groups of juvenile birds. Now, the adults actually leave and the juveniles are all on their own when they're like 3 weeks old. So they have to learn to communicate as a group and help each other find food. So they form a giant communal roost where all the juvenile birds share information about food and can exchange that information efficiently. And just as a side note, when I was looking up queleas, they are the most abundant wild bird in the world with a population estimated to be 1.5 billion. And so they form flocks that may contain millions of birds, and they feed on grass seed and open kind of shrubby grasslands. And this photo was captured by a photographer in Kenya of a huge flock of queleas using a water hole at the same time as a herd of elephants. And this flock was actually so big and so raucous, it actually startled the elephants away from the watering hole. So you can see the elephant kind of on the bottom there is like, I'm out. I'm not going to compete with a million birds for water. But in any event, those juvenile queleas are communicating at the roost about information, where to get food. So a really big question actually remains, why would a bird willingly share the location of food with other birds, right? When you think about competition, wouldn't the bird want to keep that knowledge to itself so it doesn't have to share? Those other birds are effectively competition. Well, one possibility is defending that resource from other birds in the area, other birds of the same species. So for instance, ravens may kind of take like a posse of birds from their own roost to a carcass to make sure ravens from a different roost can't feed there and won't get the food. One is the age-old safety in numbers. You know, the time spent foraging and feeding, for example, say at a carcass, might be safer with many eyes looking out for predators. And a third possibility is that by demonstrating knowledge of the location of food, a bird might be signaling that is a suitable mate, right? Smart is sexy. So maybe a bird of the other gender might think, that bird really knows its stuff. I want to mate with them. Okay, could be, or it could be a combination of all three of these. Okay, so last but not least, I've already actually mentioned this a few times, but I want to talk about one of the most important reasons that birds flock together, and that is for protection. So this is a photo of a peregrine falcon swooping on a flock of European starlings. And this photo was taken in the Central Valley. The photographer is Nick Dunlop. We're going to see a couple more of his pictures, but so, right, when you have a lot of birds in a flock, you have increased chances of spotting a predator, right? More birds, there's more lookouts. And each bird can spend more time looking for food and less time being vigilant, watching out for predators. And when they give an alarm call, it's alerting all the birds in the area. So it's just an effective way to kind of communicate information that a predator is here. So let's talk a little bit about vigilance, right? So for instance, ostriches, which live in flocks, they have to keep an eye out for lions. So at any given time, at least one bird is playing lookout while the others forage. So you can see, right, they have to put their head down. They can't be looking for lions while they're also eating. So you have a couple of birds kind of acting as lookouts or sentinels to keep the rest of the flock safe. And then they trade off, right? A different bird will take lookout post. And I bet, I know we're not muted and you can't actually answer me, but I bet you can think of a local bird that often conspicuously posts lookout for the rest of its flock. Okay, great example, of course, California quail, right? They take turns watching out for the flock. You have one bird posted up high, maybe on a fence post or the top of a shrub, while the rest of the flock is foraging below. They take turns, you know, that bird will go down to forage and another bird will take its place. So that allows each bird to spend more time getting food. And there's a picture of the flock. Okay, now, of course, if a predator gives chase, there is a lower chance of an individual in a flock being caught by that predator, right? Birds that get separated from the flock are more likely to be eaten. So birds in the flock can more effectively kind of execute this evasive maneuver than a single bird. And so I've got a series of photos here by photographer Nick Dunlop of peregrine falcons pursuing flocks of European starlings. This was all shot in the Central Valley. So you can see how the flocking behavior of the starlings is advantageous to them, right? Number one, the peregrine falcon has a very hard time picking out a single target from this shifting mass of birds. And also just sheer odds, the odds that any one individual bird is going to get eaten are way lower when it's in a big flock. Okay, here's another photo, and I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but you know, you've got almost this crazy column, and the densest area near the top there, it almost looks like maybe a tree. You can see a tiny dot on the right. That is the peregrine. The birds are really clumping up where the peregrine is. Okay, here's another incredible photo. So seeing these pictures, and I bet many of you hopefully maybe have seen flocks of birds, either starlings or maybe shorebirds, you know, all flying. Even swallows can do this, right? Cliff swallows can do it too. Birds reacting to the presence of a predator by making these dense flocks and then twisting, turning, you know, really evading. And so this begs the question, how on earth do birds do this? Well, this has actually been a mystery for many years, and over, you know, the decades and going back, you know, people have always seen this behavior, and there were some really crazy theories. I actually went back and kind of looked up. They ranged from natural telepathy, thought transference. The birds were using some kind of biological radio, or you know, disembodied electromagnetic consciousness. You know, basically people couldn't think of a good explanation aside from they must all be telepathically communicating with each other. Well, that, it turns out, is not actually true. There was a group of Italian researchers, and they actually started filming starling flocks in Rome, and they used 3 high-speed cameras, and then they used this special tracking software to analyze the recordings of the birds. And what's really interesting is that they discovered that each bird is tracking 6 or 7 birds around them in the flock. And instead of copying the direction in which a bird, the neighbor bird, flies, each bird is copying how sharply its neighbor turns. That sounds like kind of a fussy distinction, but it's actually a really important one. What it means is the message to turn like starts from a few birds, and then it very quickly sweeps through the flock at 20 to 40 meters per second, which is about 90 miles an hour. And that means for a flock of 400 birds, it takes about half a second for the whole flock to turn. And what's really interesting is that the math equations that they actually use to describe the motion and movement of the flocking birds are nearly identical to those that describe the movement of supercooled liquid helium. So they were actually using these really intense physics equations to kind of solve this math problem of how the birds were doing it, right? So instead of a bird, again, we kind of think about a bird that's surrounded by, hundreds, maybe even thousands of birds around it. It's only paying attention to the birds in its immediate vicinity. And all it's doing is cueing in on when and at what angle to turn. Okay. And so it's just following the turn and following the next turn. And the birds on the outside of the flock, maybe the ones who are actually evading the predator, are the ones making that kind of decision to turn, and the other birds are just following it. So what you get then as a result, I've got a couple pictures there below, are these just crazy sort of configurations of flocks. And we'll end with one last photo. I love this one because it looks like a rabbit head. But it's truly an incredible phenomenon. And, all these reasons for flocking that I talked about, in general, birds are not choosing just one reason to join a flock, right? They're weighing up all those benefits, and it may be a combination of all these things that we talked about. And with that, I will finish and I will take any questions. And I apologize, at the very beginning, I forgot to say that if you are Zooming in and you have a question, you can type it in the chat, and then I will look at the chat and I can answer questions. And for those folks in person, I believe Mark is gonna take the questions and he'll repeat them to me. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Okay, and if you're on the Zoom and you have a question, go ahead, put it in the chat and I can access the chat. I just have to figure out how to there's the chat. And so if you would like to, you can type something in the chat, and then if you're in person, Mark can take your question and repeat it to me. So I will take any questions that anybody has. Thank you.
So Jessica, we have a question here in our audience.
Yes.
She was outside at her home, and a stream of geese went by in a single line that lasted miles and miles, kind of contrary to the V formation. Any insight on why they might have just been lining up?
Yes. So I actually see this too in cormorants. And you all may have seen it too. If you're, looking offshore, especially during the right time of year, you may see just stream after stream. The most important part of the energy savings is that the bird flying behind is offset from the leader. So the energy savings will still work whether they're in a line or a V. And so it's actually a great question. I don't know of any research that's been done. I think the V allows the flock to really stay together and not be super strung out. But I think when you must have like really enormous numbers of birds where you just have a super huge, maybe things like, I don't know, maybe snow geese where you're just getting incredible numbers, forming the V isn't so important. But the most, so flying in a offset kind of diagonal line will still work to save energy.
That's interesting because we're going into elementary classrooms, and one of the programs is on migration, and we talk about how geese fly in the V because directly behind a goose, the vortex, the air is pushing down. But if you go outside a little bit, it's giving you uplift.
Yes.
So the same idea that you've expressed. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so if the bird is kind of moving, if it moves directly behind that leader, right? It's in that detrimental kind of downwash area, and it has to change the way it's beating its wings so that it's out of sync with that lead bird. And then that can kind of avoid that downwash a little bit. But yes, you're exactly right. That's exactly it. I got a question in the chat. Okay. I see. Okay, we've got the first question is, do mixed species feeding flocks ever form those big evasive flocks if a predator appears, like maybe kind of like a murmuration, like in the picture, but just smaller? And generally, those mixed species feeding flocks are usually feeding in vegetation. So they're usually like in the trees, in the shrubs. And so because they're already like in vegetation, they'll usually just like either drop down, they'll go like to the center of the tree, or if they're in the shrubs, they'll drop down into the shrub. Usually the species that are forming those large flocks like that are in a big open habitat. So generally, the answer to that is no. However, I'm trying to think of if I've ever seen like a mixed species flock of like swallows forming kind of an invasive flock to a predator. And I don't know that I have. I don't think it would be out of the question if you had like a large mixed species flock that was out in the open, you may see that. But generally, when we talked about those mixed species foraging flocks, they're kind of often, in the vegetation, especially those like perching birds. And then I have another question in the chat. What is the role of bird smell in those massive flock movements? And actually, most bird species do not have a well-developed sense of smell. There's only a handful that really do. Some seabirds have a really good sense of smell. Turkey vultures have a really good sense of smell. Most other birds have a pretty poorly developed sense of smell. So as far as we can tell, bird smell doesn't play too much of a role. Okay, and then do you have any other questions from in person, Mark?
Yeah, what's interesting to me is my son Lucas has become a pretty great birder, and he's got lots of friends that are all in his age group. He's now a senior, 18, and they're really into what they call mob tapes to bring in the flock. And one of their favorite birds to include in the mob tape is the chestnut-backed chickadee or an owl. So if they play the chestnut-backed chickadee call, the call note, then birds come right in. And they're very curious. They probably think it's another chickadee that is going to show them where food is, but instead it's bird watchers trying to take their picture. But they do pretty well with these mob tapes at finding birds that no one else seems to find. So it's pretty.
Yeah, you're kind of hacking the system there. Right? Yeah. I mean, and but also chestnut-backed chickadees have a well-developed alarm call. So I don't know which call they're using, if they're just using the regular chickadee call or if they're using the chickadee alarm call.
The alarm call, I think.
Okay, right. So lots of other species know that alarm call.
Right.
Because chickadees are kind of this nuclear species, and they are good at communicating across species lines, other birds know how to recognize that alarm call. And so will come in to mob the predator to make the predator less effective.
Right.
So I didn't actually talk about mobbing. That is actually another type of flock, right? A gathering of birds all together for kind of a specific function to mob a predator, right? In order to demonstrate to the predator, we see you. Element of surprise is not going to work. And also to just harass the predator to the point where it wants to leave the area. So yeah, that's actually another great flock function that I didn't talk about.
So they also tend to play the pygmy owl toot, so which that'll bring in birds to.
That'll bring in birds. They want to mob that.
Exactly.
Mob that pygmy owl, get it out of there.
The smart adaptation for finding birds.
Yeah.
Their group has found a lot of first county records, second county records.
That's cool.
All over the state. So.
Yeah, kind of exploiting that hack. So while you're getting another question, I will, in the chat, someone asked, what about mixed flocks of shorebirds forming flocks? And that's actually a great question. And it's totally possible that somebody else who's spent more time observing shorebirds, but can answer. But I have seen especially when you've got a situation where you have like, maybe it's, either early winter or like real early spring or late fall, and you're in shorebird migration, and you have a lot of mixed species in an area. I live close to Morro Bay, so I go birding in Morro Bay all the time, and lots of shorebirds there during the right time of year. And there are peregrine falcons that will roost and nest on Morro Rock right there. And when those birds come in, yes, you will actually get like all the shorebirds, a mixed species flock, basically kind of all taking off. What I have seen though is that the birds of each kind of shorebird species seem to kind of tend to form their own little evasive flock. So they may kind of separate out. So there's probably a little bit of mixing, but the birds of similar sizes are the ones that are going to do that evasive flocking most effectively. It would be very difficult for like, larger birds, think, I don't know, like willets or something, to effectively maneuver in a flock of, say, peeps. So if the birds are, but you could get, Western and least sandpipers, which are two different species, totally forming that, those evasive flocks together. So I think it depends a lot on body size too.
Yeah, it's really interesting when peregrine falcon comes over shorebirds. When they take off, just like you said, the smaller ones are in one group and the larger are in another group, which makes total sense because
they need to kind of
in a small flock would get picked off probably.
Yeah, and they need to, in order to do that evasive maneuvering effectively, the birds kind of need to be the same size. I got one question here. Do you know of any raptors that migrate together, and do they ever make formations? To my knowledge, you do get certain areas, right? I mean, boy, the Marin headlands are like, great funnel point. You may see tons of raptors passing through the area. However, raptors do not seem to form what I would consider like a true social flock. They're kind of migrating solitarily. They just may happen to migrate where lots of other raptors are. And they typically do not need to form these formations because they're the predator.
Yeah, I would add to that, like if raptors for the most part will try to find thermals to rise to high heights and then glide as far as they can.
Yeah.
So it's more of an independent function.
Yeah, exactly. They're not really depending on traveling with a flock to help reduce their energy usage. And then I want to kind of make sure I'm not excluding the in-person group. Any other questions from the in-person crowd?
Mine crowd, let's think. No, I think they've really enjoyed the talk though.
Okay.
Great, Jessica. Yeah.
I got one more from the chat. Any books that you recommend about flock migrations? Oh gosh. And this is really terrible, but I actually don't have any off the top of my head. But possibly other Audubon chapter members might, excuse me, recommend a book. I don't actually have one off the top of my head. I apologize for that.
Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. There is one book that I want to particularly ask you. I'm a librarian by background, so I take a lot of interest in books, not just nature itself. Anyway, there's a book called Flight's Path by Rebecca Hisman, Heisman, that I found at the local library, public library here in Solano County. And have you read it, or do you? It seems that she's covering a lot of scientists who have done, I guess, similar works that they're doing. And again, I haven't had a chance to read it for many reasons, family reasons especially. And I just thought maybe you might come across it, or it's published in 2023.
Oh, that's
anyway,
really new.
That's what it is.
That's a great recommendation.
New, relatively new. So I just thought I'd point it out to you and to other people. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
If you haven't read.
Thanks. Flight Path by Rebecca Hisman.
I'd be curious what you think of it.
That's a great recommendation. I have not actually read that, but I will absolutely check it out. It does sound really fascinating and probably has a ton more information than, you know, what I can give you guys in a talk, but great, thanks.
Thank you for your time.
You bet. Okay, I think that's it from questions from the chat. Any further questions in person?
I think you covered it very well, Jessica, and
Great.
I love the concepts you came up with, and it pulled together a lot of things that I've been thinking about. So it's great.
Excellent.
Our crowd would love to thank you for a very inspirational talk, and we've had over 35 people, so it's been a great meeting.
Wonderful.
I'd like to remind folks, our next meeting is Thursday, May the 9th. We'll have the election results, and we'll have a fantastic presentation by the Hamiltons and the Stevensons on Sierra birding. So don't miss that one. In-person meeting will be at the Napa Valley Lutheran Church like tonight. And it'll be our last meeting of the year, so we'll have lots of refreshments. So come in person if you can. And then I'd also like to remind folks not to forget all of the Earth Day activities. We'll have those up on our website tomorrow so that you don't miss out on anything. And don't forget our big day of birding, which will be Saturday, May the 4th. So thank you very much, Jessica, to you. That was a very interesting talk, and it would be great if we could find more papers on that subject, because I think really
It's fascinating.
it's a very fascinating topic, and you know, it has to do with migration. It has to do with how birds are successful in migration, and
Yeah.
also how they're successful evading predators and finding food. So
Yeah.
all really good topics.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a wonderful time. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, there we go. Don't know if the
Thank
online
you.
add their chatter, but thank you very much. It was great.
Okay.
So we'll be in touch, and thank you
Okay.
so much for your presentation.
You bet.
All
Everyone
right.
have a great night.
Thanks, folks. Good night.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night. Thank you for everything.